Moving forward, let's talk about the man-child a little bit. Notice that this man-child is described as ruling with a rod of iron. That's important because it'll tie us to some other passages in the Bible that help us to identify the man-child. Undoubtedly, Jesus is the man-child. Or, this is my present position on it, I think Jesus is the first of a company of people that are being referred to with what you call a corporate or a group singular as the man-child, just like the bride. The bride sounds like it's one person, doesn't it? But we know the bride is a group of people under that title, and I think the man-child is the same. I believe the difference between the title the man-child and the title the bride is very simple. The bride is all the overcomers produced before the marriage supper other than Jesus. Jesus isn't part of the bride. He's the bridegroom. Once Jesus marries his bride, there's going to be a group made up of Jesus and his bride. And I presently lean heavily toward the idea that the title, the man-child, is a title for that group. So technically, it could refer to people that are part of the bride, that you'd also be part of what's called the man-child company or element, whatever word you want to use for it. The difference being Jesus is part of the man-child element. It's those who have gone on to full perfection that are all part of this group called the man-child. The bride are all those who've gone on to full perfection, again, other than Jesus, because he's marrying the bride. So he went on to full perfection, and later the rest will go on to full perfection, and the ones who he's going to marry are the bride. But the whole group of all those who are the fully developed children of God, including Jesus, might be what is being referred to as the man-child element. So if Jesus was the first one who went on to full perfection, and he was caught up to God and his throne, he was the first of what I'm referring to as a company that is the man-child. And then those who went on to perfection after that become part of the bride, who technically will also be part of that man-child company as well, because all overcomers are part of that company. So you can see how the man-child could be a bigger title that would include any overcomer, and that the first of those, one that was caught up to God in his throne in this passage, would be Christ. But to build a case for why I think this is true, let's start with the word for ruling. It's the Greek word poimaino. It actually is the word that refers to the work of a shepherd. It means to tend the sheep or to shepherd them. It's easier for us to understand ruling someone with a rod of iron rather than shepherding them with a rod of iron, but it actually refers to shepherding. It's used 11 different times in the New Testament. 7 of the 11 in the King James Version, it's translated as some form of the word feed, because the idea behind it being that a shepherd is tending his sheep, he's feeding his sheep. The other 4 times it's used, it is translated rule. In Matthew 2:6, it's translated rule, where it could probably just have been as easily translated shepherd when it's describing Jesus as a governor that would rule my people Israel. It could have said that would shepherd my people Israel. The other 3 times are all referring to this ruling with a rod of iron, and they're all in the book of Revelation. They're in Revelation 2:27, here in 12:5, and in Revelation 19:15. The only other time that it's used in Revelation is in Revelation 7:17, where it describes the Lamb as being in the midst of the throne, and he'll feed them and lead them unto living fountains of waters, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Looking at this work of ruling with a rod of iron, it'll help us to understand who the man-child might be, and it'll help to build a case for the definition that I'm using for the man-child. In Psalms 2:9, it says, "Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." That is a clear parallel with this kind of language, and it's referring to the work of Jesus, and potentially his bride with him. Revelation 19:15 says, "Out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God." This is exactly the same kind of phrase in Revelation 19:15. It's being used here in 12:5, and it's undoubtedly talking about Jesus. So if we see a man-child that's going to rule with a rod of iron in Revelation 12:5, and we're trying to figure out who it is, if you go forward 7 chapters and what amounts to 10 verses in 19:15, you'll see that the exact same description is used of Jesus. So clearly, Jesus is either the man-child, singular, or he's the first and the preeminent one in the company that constitutes a group that'll be the man-child, like we use the bride of Christ. There's another place, though, that gives you some evidence for the reason why I think the man-child means what it does. And that's in Revelation 2:26-27, when it says, "He that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father." That passage is one of the best reasons to see this man-child in Revelation 12 as beginning with Christ. He's the first man-child, so to speak, and part of the company that you might call the man-child, like, again, we use the title the bride, though in a slightly different way, and that anyone else who overcomes will be filling the very same role. It's using the exact same phrase, that overcomers will rule with a rod of iron, that's used for Jesus and that's used for the man-child, which means it seems to imply those who will go on to perfection, those who overcome, will be part of this man-child group. Jesus was the first, and for at least a few years, he was the only one who was the man-child, or part of, maybe more accurately, part of that man-child company. Which, by the way, might help you with the phrase that he was caught up to God in his throne. We know Jesus was caught up to God in his throne, but there's not a single verse in the Bible that tells us that any of the overcomers after Jesus in the early church period, when they died, were caught up to God in his throne. There's some people who believe in the idea of moving out as a live soul who think that's essentially what happens, but there are only a couple of verses in the entire Bible that you could possibly say support that idea, and none of them say, when you die, you'll be caught up to God in his throne. The only person that type of language is ever used of is of Jesus. So when it says there was a man-child brought to birth by this woman and he was caught up to God in his throne, I think that's referring to the fact that Jesus became the first man-child, or the first of the company that's the man-child company, and he was caught up to God in his throne. Now, if that is a company, like I'm using it, a governmental group, so to speak, that's made up of both the bridegroom and the bride, the husband and the wife, then until the full bride company is made up, the full company that is the man-child won't be in existence. We have Jesus as a man-child, but the rest of that company, if the rest of that company is made up of the bride, will have to be all constituted, all brought to that level before we can have a fully constituted company that might be called the man-child. By the way, the fact that it's called a man-child has nothing to do with it only being made up of males in terms of masculine gender. The New Testament uses the masculine gender sometimes to refer to mankind in general, not just to males. Just like the bride, though that is a female description, is not a group that only is constituted of women. The man-child element, if it is a group, would not be a group only constituted of men. I think it's being used, as I keep saying, in the very same way the bride company is being used, as a group. It's just talking about a child that was born, that a man-child in the sense of a spiritually developed child of God. So Christ, is the first of that group that constitutes the man-child, was caught up to God in his throne when he returned to third heaven. You see that in the first chapter of Acts. Then we have to determine, and this is where we differ among our churches, on whether or not people go immediately into heaven if they're an overcomer at death, or whether or not they are waiting for a future resurrection for all of the bride members to rise at the same time. Some believe that early church bride members get caught up in the same way Jesus got caught up, that they go right up onto God at the point of their death. But you realize he did not go up to God at the point of his death. He lay in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. So if we're following in his pattern, the pattern is not physical death and the soul moves out and goes up to God. The pattern Jesus set was physical death, physical resurrection, and then in a bodily form, he went up to God. Very likely sometime right after his physical resurrection, and then he came back. But he very definitely went up to God when he ascended into the clouds in the first chapter of Acts. But I want to stress this again. Jesus did not die and then move out as a live soul, a living soul, into some other body and on into heaven at his death. And he's the pattern we're following, and so why wouldn't his death and resurrection be a pattern we'd follow? He had a physical death. He lay dead in the grave for a period of time. Then he had a physical resurrection into what I believe was a glorified new body, but he didn't go first into heaven to get that body. He got that body as part of his physical resurrection. Then after that, he ascended into heaven. After he lay in the grave in a dead physical body, and then that dead physical body was raised and transformed and changed, reconstituted into a glorified body. Then after that, after the physical death and after a physical resurrection, then he ascended into heaven. So if you're going to follow the pattern that's actually in the Bible, You are not going to see anybody described as moving out as a live soul. As we've talked about in some of our Bible studies and ministerial discussions, you do have a couple of statements, that's all, in the entire Bible, less than a handful of statements that talk about the hope of just being with God and not being in this body and this life anymore. But none of those statements specifically say that that hope means at the exact moment your physical body dies, you're going to be in some soul form in heaven. They're basically just saying it would be better to be with God than to be here. It'd be better to be out of here, out of this physical condition, and with God. That doesn't mean it's immediate at death. So if we're going to be biblical, we ought to look at examples like I just gave of what actually happened with Jesus, and we ought to look at what the vast majority of the Bible says. And I strongly believe that heavily, if not incontrovertibly, supports the idea that you have to have a physical resurrection before you're going to ascend up into heaven. Not that you move out at death as a living soul into heaven and then get a body there or get a body later. That is simply not what the Bible describes. So now that I've introduced a controversial element, I hope it didn't push anyone's buttons among brethren that believe it differently, especially when I'm saying it that strong. But I'm saying it that way because I believe the Bible, when you take all of what it has to say, is very clear. All right, well, we ended that with controversial element. We're going to get into one that's even more controversial among some of our brethren and discuss the great red dragon. It's described here with 7 heads and 10 horns. This is controversial for several reasons. There is not just 2 different views about what this is representing. There are multiple different views among our churches. There are some who believe this great red dragon is Satan, who is the devil, who is the serpent, and that's all one spiritual individual entity, a celestial being, referred to by all those titles. There are some who believe in Satan as a spiritual individual celestial entity, but they think the great red dragon and some of those titles are not referring to Satan himself. They're referring to fleshly or satanically influenced governments or other things. And then there are some who think all of it is referring to fleshly, natural, human-originated things, and there is no singular supernatural entity who is Satan, that's just referring to the carnal and fleshly nature. This is certainly one of the most divisive issues among our churches, so I'm going to try to be as careful as I can with this, but I believe this pretty strongly, so I hope anyone who hears me speak on this, if it sounds like I'm being dogmatic, will not be offended if they see it differently. The Greek word translated dragon in this description is the word drakos. It's used 13 times in 12 verses in the Bible. Every single one of them are in the book of Revelation. The Greek word pyros, or pyros, or puros, depending on how you pronounce Greek, and it's pronounced several different ways, is the word that's translated red here. It's where we get pyre from, like a pile someone's body is burned on at death, or even a pyromaniac. Someone's a maniac when it comes to fire. Fire being associated with color red. It's only used 2 times in the New Testament. It's here in Revelation 12 describing the great red dragon, which appears to imply it's a fiery red. And in Revelation 6:4, it's used to describe the red horse that I believe pictures the church as it began to fall away into carnality, and even more so, what I think it represents, falling into a state of division and conflict. We think of arguments and fighting and debate as fiery, don't we? But not only that, red is associated with blood and conflict and warfare, which is one reason I believe the red horse the way that I do, along with the fact that the description associated with the red horse is all about division and conflict. It's not about carnality primarily, it's about division and conflict. It's interesting, if you are a student of history and culture, that this imagery of a red dragon is found in almost every one of the ancient cultures, particularly the ancient cultures of this part of the world, including the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and the Hittites, and even Indian and Greek culture. A drakon, or a dragon, was almost always connected with demonic spiritual powers in the ancient world. In Babylon, there was a red serpent or dragon-like figure that was pictured as a guardian of their god Marduk, who was the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. And if you see a picture of the Babylonian Ishtar gate, you'll see a dragon-like creature pictured on it. In the ancient Near East, many of the cultures had beliefs about a dragon-like sea monster that symbolized the war between good and evil and the conditions of chaos and warfare that might be going on in the spiritual realm. None of those things have any bearing on how we might interpret this, by the way. We need to use the Bible, and that is where I begin in my understanding of what I think this dragon is. To put it very simply, as I said in the beginning, I believe the dragon is the same thing as Satan, is the same thing as the serpent, and is the same thing as the devil. When those titles are used together in a package, they're used in a way that is referring to one single thing, not to a variety of different things that are the expression of one thing, like it's the fleshly condition and here's different ways it can manifest. It says the dragon is the serpent, is the devil, or is Satan. It doesn't say it's a form of it or a manifestation of it or some expression of it. And so if we're using proper grammar, whatever is being described as the dragon would have to be the same thing as what's being described as Satan, would have to be the same thing as what's being described as the serpent, would have to be the same thing as what's being described as the devil. Our view of the devil, and again, forgive me for being dogmatic about this, for those that see it different, I certainly don't want to intentionally offend, but our view of the devil is the only view that is consistent grammatically, logically, and biblically with those facts. That is exactly how the Bible uses those titles for one single thing, and not for different expressions, as I said, of something, or things that are not one single thing. But without wading any deeper into that, let's look at the 7 heads and 10 horns. The 7 heads, I believe, represent the 7 kingdoms up to this point that have been interacting with the people of God, usually abusing them in some form, the last of which would be the pseudo-Christian Roman Empire. And then we see that there's 10 horns that are on the 7th beast, and you also see there's another set of 10 horns on the 8th beast when it comes into power. It might be that those 10 powers are involved in the judgment during each of those eras represented by the 7 heads, which is what the number 10 can represent at times, is judgment. The great red dragon is not synonymous with the beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns, which is part of why some try to make the argument the great red dragon was the Roman Empire and that was the beast that had the 7 heads and 10 horns. The problem is they are presented very clearly as 2 separate things in the 13th chapter of Revelation. And by the way, it wouldn't be logical for the dragon to have 7 heads if it was pagan Rome, because pagan Rome, before Rome became pseudo-Christian, was the 6th beast. Beside that, the dragon preceded the beast. It came before the beast, despite the fact that they're both described with 7 heads and 10 horns. In Revelation 13, the power that creates the 7-headed beast came from the 7-headed dragon, which means it had to exist in some sense before the 7-headed beast came into being. I think they both have 7 heads and 10 horns because one is a reflection of the other. The dragon is the power behind the beast. I believe the dragon is just another title for Satan, and I believe Satan is an individual celestial entity who is the influence and power behind the beast. I just proved to you that the beast came from the dragon. They can't be the same thing. So if the beast came from the dragon and they both have 7 heads and 10 horns, that seems to obviate the argument that the dragon is the Roman Empire and the beast is the Roman Empire when one comes from the other and they both have the same number of heads and horns. Which means the only option, in my humble opinion, is that since we know one came from the other, they're not the same thing, but they have the same exact description, the dragon is the one who brought the beast into existence. But again, if they both have 7 heads and 10 horns, it can't be one empire bringing another one into existence, or the first would be described with 6 heads and the next would be described with 7. Instead, they're both described that way, which means the dragon would almost have to be something that the beast is a perfect reflection of, that wasn't a kingdom that preceded it, which falls perfectly into sync with our understanding of Satan, that beastly kingdom that had 7 heads and 10 horns was a perfect reflection of the power that brought it into being, Satan. I know someone's immediately going to say to me, well, human beings or human kingdoms are referred to as dragons in the Bible. Okay, that actually just goes right along with what I just said. If there is someone who is the dragon, and there are human beings or human kingdoms who imitate whoever that personal entity is who is the dragon, they could be called dragons, couldn't they? Aren't we supposed to be sheep, lambs? Jesus is the lamb. He's a singular celestial entity who has certain qualities. And if we take on the qualities of that singular celestial entity that is the lamb, we'll be good sheep. We'll be good lambs. So anytime someone says to me, I have the proof that the dragon is just a human being or a human kingdom, and their argument is humans are called by titles like dragon or even serpent for that matter, that doesn't prove anything. Because like I said, Jesus is called the lamb and we are sheep. That doesn't mean that because we're called lambs, the lamb must be the human nature. Of course not. Any more than it would have to mean because people are called serpents or dragons. The serpent, singular, the dragon, singular, would have to be the human nature. That simply does not work the way God uses titles in the Bible. And as I said, all you have to do is look at the title, the Lamb, to see it. Jesus is the Lamb. That's one single celestial entity. If men are called lambs or called sheep, it's because they are like him in some way. Which, if you parallel that and let the same biblical type of framework for definition apply to the dragon, if Satan is called the dragon and he's called the serpent, the singular, then anybody who is called a dragon or a serpent is just somebody who has his qualities, who is like him in some way. Ezekiel uses that kind of language for Pharaoh being called a great dragon, or perhaps even Egypt as a whole being referred to that way in Ezekiel 29:3. Jeremiah talks about Nebuchadnezzar as a dragon in Jeremiah 51:34. And by the way, listen to the way this words it. Talks about Nebuchadnezzar being like a dragon in Jeremiah 51:34. Not that he is a dragon, but he's like one. Isaiah uses that kind of language, though it's not clear whether Isaiah is talking about a visible human agent or a kingdom, or whether he's talking about an invisible celestial entity when he's talking in Isaiah 27:1 about punishing Leviathan, the piercing serpent, the crooked serpent, and slaying the dragon that's in the sea, or in Isaiah 51:9 when he says, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Art thou not it that hath cut Rahab," which is usually a title associated prophetically with Egypt, "and wounded the dragon." Well, is that saying Rahab is the dragon, or is that saying when he cut Rahab, he wounded whoever the person is or entity is that's the dragon? As I was pointing out, I have had people get very animated with me in bringing up the very verses I just quoted and saying, see, this proves. These are human beings or human kingdoms. At least some of them might prove that. Not all of them, as I just showed you. That they're being referred to as a dragon or a serpent. Well, a couple of them might be saying that for sure in Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Isaiah's are a whole lot more vague. But even if Ezekiel and Jeremiah prove that someone could be called a dragon, or if you could use examples in the Bible where it calls someone a serpent, that doesn't really have any bearing based on what I said about the other titles in the Bible, like the title the Lamb and the title sheep or lambs that we bear. It doesn't make us Jesus, and it doesn't make Jesus the human nature because humans are called lambs, any more than it would mean the same that the serpent is the fallen nature because humans are called serpents. It just means there was somebody who had the title the serpent or the lamb who has had influence on people, and the ones that follow the lamb become lamb-like. They become sheep. The ones that follow whoever this being is that's the serpent, not a nature, a being, because remember the lamb's a being, become serpent-like and thus could be called serpents. All right, that's probably my most confrontational and conflict-creating part of this subject, and I pray those brethren who I love very dearly and respect highly, who believe it differently than me, won't be overly irritated or offended by my addressing it as directly and maybe forcibly as I might do when I'm going through a passage like this. But I believe it pretty simply. If there's an invisible power, a person who's an invisible power, a personal entity, behind the visible potentates, rulers, or political systems of this fallen world, kingdoms, empires, whatever, it wouldn't be surprising to find those rulers or those political systems being referred to with language that describes them just like it describes him if they've taken on his qualities, exactly like I said, as that language is used of people that have taken on the qualities of Jesus being referred to with titles that are just like his title, of a lamb or other things. Let's move on. In this description, it describes the dragon's tail drawing a third of the stars of heaven and casting them to the earth. Trying to figure out what the dragon's tail represents isn't as simple as it might sound. You'd have to look at how the Bible uses the tail of something in prophetic passages to try to determine what it might be representing. It could refer to the end of the tail being like the tail end, like the phrase we use, the tail end of something, meaning that the tail end of the beastly system is what brought down those stars, one of the last of the beasts that are listed. Though I think that would be a very complex way of getting there. I've heard some make that argument. It could also refer to the deceitful, false doctrinal message that brought those stars down from heaven. Not in the sense of T-A-L-E, like a tale, like a story. We could use that word play, but that would be very misleading because it's not what the word here means. It doesn't mean the dragon's story drew a third of the stars. I've heard some use that, and I understand. If you're going to do that practically, that's fine, but that's not what this word is talking about. It's talking about a tail like the tail of an animal. So we'd have to look at how that word is used, not tail like a story, T-A-L-E, but T-A-I-L in English, and see if it gives us some clues as to what this kind of tail might represent. The clearest biblical passage that talks about a tail in a prophetic passage that might help us with this is in Isaiah 9:14-16. It says, "The Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and rush in one day. The ancient and honorable, he is the head, and the prophet that teacheth lies, he is the tail." As I said, that could be a huge help to us in understanding what this might represent, because there are ministers, there are false prophets, so to speak, that have taught lies that are the ministers who are working for that dragon. And here in Isaiah 9, the tail is referring to false prophets teaching lies. It directly states that. And it shows you how this kind of language can be used symbolically. So the ancient and honorable are being referred to as the head. They're in a higher place. And the tail are those who are not honorable, who are deceptive, who are false prophets. And as I said, it's very straight. It says, "A prophet that teaches lies, he is the tail." So if we just took that one scripture and applied it to this statement of Revelation 12, it may mean that the tail of the dragon was a minister or ministry that was teaching lies, that was part of the dragon's work. This is a false minister, a false ministry, a false prophet or prophets that are teaching lies that are part of the dragon's operation. Which you're going to see as we go on with this, that there is a war in heaven between the dragon and his angels and Michael and his angels, which could also be a parallel with this, that there is false teaching going on. In this period when the church fell away, it was the tail of the dragon, which again, if the tail is referring to false ministers or prophets, it would have been a false ministry or false prophets influenced by the dragon, who are the ones that destroyed that church. They taught lies. Just like the prophet here that's referred to as the tail, they were teaching lies. Teaching for doctrine, the traditions of men and other things that changed the meaning of the Bible, added to the meaning of the Bible, subtracted from the meaning of the Bible and of the gospel message. So that could connect a tail to something that is a source of false doctrine or of spiritual adulteration of some kind. And forgive me, but in a very blunt way, the tail area under the tail is where waste leaves an animal. And certainly there was foul spiritual waste that was coming forth from whatever this tail was. If we're talking about an apostate ministry, which is probably very likely what this is talking about, that the dragon's tail were false prophets and a false ministry who were influenced by the dragon and that were spewing out the filth of his false doctrine and were the origin of some of the man-made customs and traditions that changed the identity of that church. In the story of Samson, you'll see him tying together the tails of 300 foxes in pairs and then binding a firebrand between each of them so that when the foxes were sent out in the fields of the Philistines, it burned up their crops. That's in Judges 15:4-5. We saw in Isaiah that a tail can represent a false prophet or false minister, but foxes also represent that kind of a picture in the Bible. Rezin of Syria and Pekah of Israel are both referred to in this kind of way. In Isaiah 7:4 it says, "Say unto him, take heed and be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted, for the two tails of these smoking firebrands. For the fierce anger of Rezin was Syria and of the son of Remaliah." Revelation 9 has several references to locust-like and horse-like creatures that have tails like scorpions or serpents. I'm not going to get into defining all that here, but understanding how a tail is used that we've been talking about might help you with those passages. That it is probably referring to a false ministry that is being referred to as the tails, and the locust-like and horse-like creatures could be a church or a religious group that have that false ministry, and that those tails are affecting people just like the poison of a scorpion or a serpent, all of which I believe is symbolic in its meaning. When it's talking about him drawing the third of the stars from heaven, the Greek word translated drew is suro, S-U-R-O. It is talking about dragging or pulling something. It's often a word that's used in the sense of pulling in your net, or even what we would think of as a fishing line to catch a fish after you've hooked it. It's the word used in John 21:8 when it's talking about the disciples drawing in, and there it's translated in the King James Version as dragging the net with fishes. It's used for Paul hailing Christians out of their homes to put them into prison, which means he wasn't calling them to come out. He was dragging them out of their homes to put them into prison. That's in Acts 8:3, by the way. which means this isn't just drawing someone in some subtle way. This appears to be a very aggressive, pulling people down from being in a heavenly state down into a place that's not. Another thing you have to study the symbolic use of to understand this passage in the Bible is how stars are used in the Bible, and whether or not it's referring to celestial beings or to human beings. The majority of the time that the term stars are used for a group of individuals, it is referring to human beings, though I do think there's at least a couple of where it's undeniably referring to celestial beings. Abraham's children are compared with stars in Genesis 15:5 and 22:17 and 26:4 and elsewhere. Jacob's sons in Joseph's dream are referred to as stars in Genesis 37:9. Jesus, who you might say is being referred to as a human being or a celestial being, is referred to with the title the star out of Jacob in Numbers 24:17. And he's referred to as the bright and morning star in Revelation 22:16. God's people in general, or maybe the leaders of God's people, seem to be referred to as stars in Daniel 8:10, when it's talking about some of the host and the stars of heaven being cast down to the ground and stamped upon. That is very similar language, by the way, to what's used in Revelation 12:4. So if we're going to pick out anything that might be a clue as to who the stars were in Revelation 12:4, figuring out who they are in Daniel 8:10 might be helpful to understand at least what kind of entities they were, whether that's referring to celestial angels or human beings. 4 chapters later in Daniel, the shining of stars in Daniel 12:3 are compared to the glory of those who turn many to righteousness. And then in a negative sense, you see stars withdrawing their shining. In Joel 2:10 and 3:15, we referred to earlier, when the sun and the moon are darkened. And that's referring to human beings. In Joel 2:10 and 3:15 that we referred to earlier on, the stars that withdraw their shining when the sun and the moon are darkened seem to be referring to human religious leaders. And the stars that fall from heaven when the powers in heaven are shaken that Jesus talks about in Matthew 24:29 and in Mark 13:25, and even that you find associated with the sixth seal in Revelation 6:12-14, seem to be referring to human religious leaders. In Jude 13, there's a description of wandering stars, which has been debated back and forth, whether that's talking about human religious leaders or whether it's talking about celestial beings. In Revelation 1:20, the 7 stars are clearly referring to the ministers of the 7 churches, which again is in that case referring to human beings. In Revelation 8:10-11, there's a star called wormwood that falls from heaven. Again, you need to remember when you're in Revelation that the majority of things there are talking about something symbolic rather than literal, but those who take that literally think it may be some astronomical occurrence. But again, you're not having literal stars falling from the literal heaven to the literal earth without destroying the entire earth long before they touch the earth. So that would seem to narrow this down to either being a celestial or a human being. And then we have a third part of the stars that are darkened in Revelation 8:12, which is interesting because it's so similar to this description that is referring to a third part of the stars. That would take me off into a much deeper discussion, so I'm going to hold that off for another time. But then in Revelation 9:1, we have a star that fell from heaven to earth and was given the key to the bottomless pit. Now, that obviously isn't talking about a star in the heavens above us, because you can't give a star like that the key to the bottomless pit. It has to be an entity of some kind, whether human or celestial. Then we get to Revelation 12, where we see this language used again. We see this woman with a crown of 12 stars, which I would imagine nearly all among our brethren have interpreted as being a group of human beings, talking about the 12 apostles. And 3 verses later, we get to one of the most controversial passages for some in this whole passage, and that is this description about a third part of the stars being cast to the earth by the dragon's tail. If the crown of 12 stars represents the rule and authority of the apostolic ministry that was existent in that day in the first verse of Revelation 12, and thus the stars in that statement represent human ministers, just like you saw in the examples of 7 stars and other examples earlier in Revelation, it would seem far more likely, contextually and consistently, to interpret the stars in Revelation 12:4 as human ministers as well. One of the reasons some may argue against that idea is that they're referred to as the stars of heaven. But what's being referred to as heaven in this chapter, I personally believe, is the religious realm that is the heaven here on earth, where and when the church is operating. So again, if the 12 stars in Revelation 12:1, and I would say all, if not most, of the examples of stars before this in the book of Revelation are clearly referring to human ministers, it's much more likely that the stars, just a couple of sentences later in the very same chapter, are also referring to human ministers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's another of those things that could potentially be very controversial. Not controversial necessarily to the folks that some of my last statements were controversial to, but perhaps more controversial to individuals with the same kind of a teaching lineage that I have. I don't personally presently believe that this third part of the stars being pulled down from heaven is referring to some primordial event when a third of the angels were pulled down by Satan. That has been the standard view of many ministers that believe Satan is a personal celestial entity, which I do believe. Before I go further into my interpretation of who I believe these stars are, what I believe it means that a third part of them were brought down from heaven, and when I think that occurred, please note, I do believe there are corrupted celestial angels, or if you don't like the word corrupted, evil celestial angels, and that they became evil or fell in some sense at some point in the primordial past, meaning before the time of the creation of the world that we see in Genesis 1, or during the period of the creation and in the early days of the creation. So let me say it again. I do believe there was a moral collapse of some of the celestial angels, and that Satan as an individual celestial entity was part of that 6,000 or more years ago. But I do not believe that is what is being referred to in Revelation 12, for several reasons that I'll give you. First of all, the stars that appear to have been swept from heaven here looks like is an event that's happening in the same time period as this woman operating and then her going into the wilderness, which would seem to connect it to some point from the early church period to the falling away of the church. It has never made sense to me that this statement would just appear out of nowhere in the middle of this chronological series of statements, that suddenly it's referring to something that happened at this point, what would have been more than 4,000 years prior to this. Just out of nowhere, you make this statement and then move on with your story. But it does make sense to see this not as celestial beings who fell from heaven at some point in the primordial past, thousands of years before this, that don't even fit into this story being told here, but instead that this is referring to religious leaders in the period that was producing the falling away of the church, and that the war in heaven that is being described here is a war between Satan, who I do see as a personal entity, and the ministers who are being influenced by Satan. That's his ministers. In this case, the term angels could just be referring to messengers. It can mean messengers. It is a word used for messengers, even more than it is used for celestial beings. So I think in this case, it's referring to the ministers who've been influenced by Satan falling from heaven because of a false ministry, or perhaps that tail represents something more specific, the tail of the dragon. Maybe that is the papal office, just like we see the man of sin being referred to, that we talked about in some of our earlier classes on the restoration of the church. It may be that tail is a singular influencing office that has influenced others that is causing them to fall from heaven, fall from their place of right relationship with God. They're in a heavenly state. Look at how the New Testament uses that. It sometimes refers to people in the church, among the people of God, as being in heavenly places, because you're in a heavenly state when the Spirit of God is present. They were in a heavenly state. They've been pulled down from that heavenly state by the teaching of false doctrine that came from that tail. The tail introduced and taught these false doctrines and traditions of men and other things, influenced a portion of the stars of heaven who might represent the ministry of that church. And then you'd have to determine whether the 1/3 were pulled down and became the church that fell away, or whether the 1/3 were pulled down in martyrdom, maybe not in corruption, but they were swept down under that power. My main difference with the way it has been taught in the past by people that believe the devil as I do believe it is that this is referring to some primordial fall of angels in the ancient past. I have no problem with the idea that angels fell, but I do not personally think that the way the title stars is used in the Bible, even though it is used in Job for angels, you notice the examples I gave you, the vast majority of the time it's referring to human beings, and the majority of those times it looks like it's referring to human religious leaders. And it would fit better with the chronology and context of this to say this was human religious leaders that were being pulled down. That doesn't change a single thing about my view of the devil. I still believe the devil is a singular individual entity. I do believe he corrupted others, and he pulled them down with him in that corruption, but I don't presently believe this is a passage referring to that. But again, it does not change anything about my view of the devil to see it the way that I presently do. Our next session I'll have on a Wednesday night in Green when we'll enter into the woman fleeing into the wilderness. But I want to close out this session with those of you who are brethren and saints that I work with in the churches that we work with around the country and in other nations. Let me just give you a few of the theories that people have had regarding the different interpretations of what this dragon's tail casting down a third of the heavens were. I've given you a couple of these in the last few minutes. Some believe this was a third of the celestial angels in heaven that were part of Satan's rebellion. I told you why I don't believe that's what this is referring to, even though I do believe that Satan is in an apostate condition and that he influenced other celestial beings to follow him in that apostate condition. I don't think that's what this is referring to. Some people believe that this is talking about a third of the Jews that were killed in the Jewish-Roman War in that 7-year period from around 67 to 73 AD, and especially at the height of it in 70 AD when the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. I don't think that that would be the case. The believers in Jesus were warned to leave when that war began. I don't think these ones who were destroyed in that war would be stars of heaven being cast down. Some people believe this is referring to something out in the future, that this is referring to a third of the Jews who are going to survive Armageddon and come through that and who will turn to Christ. That third part that's described in Zechariah 13:7-9, who seem to be brought through the fire to be refined, while 2/3 are cut off and die. That does fit in terms of it being a third, but it's another example of an interpretation that doesn't really fit the context and chronology here. This is talking about events in the first century, and it seems to be tucked right into the time period between the glory of that former house of God that was the early church and the fleeing of the woman in the wilderness and the falling away of the church that followed. Seems to be talking about something in that time period. Some people think this is talking about a third of the powers of the world, a third of the rulers who rule over the different nations of the world in that day being brought under subjection to pagan Rome, or even later by being brought into subjection by pseudo-Christian Rome. That's an interesting theory because it is pretty close to the number of the world population that at one point was under the power of the Roman Empire during that time. But that doesn't seem to fit with the context of what's going on here, where this is talking about the church, not just everybody in the world or people in general. Some think this is talking about a third of the ministry or the laity of the early church that were martyred off, that they were dragged down from heaven, so to speak, to death. And that the 2/3 that were left that weren't killed due to their beliefs or whatever the case might be went into apostasy. And though I do think that's a possibility, depending on how you translate the language here, I presently believe this is referring to a third part of the ministry, or you might include, as I said, the laity as well, of the late early church period, just before the falling away, or during the period of the falling away, who were caught up in false doctrine. And this is why I think it would probably be leaders rather than laity, because 2/3 of the church wasn't killed at any point. But 2/3 of their leaders may have been martyred off during the end of this period as you get into the late 200s and the early 300s before Constantine. So this could be referring to a third part of the ministry during the period between the early church and the woman fleeing into the wilderness, who were deceived by the message of the false minister or false ministry that is being referred to as the tail of the dragon, and that were pulled down out of their heavenly state by that. And then the others that remained in their heavenly state of relationship with the Lord ended up being martyred or dying off during this time. If that's the case, and that means that 1/3 element, that 1/3 of the ministry that fell away, became the foundation of what became the false Babylonish church. If you took it the opposite way that I mentioned just before this, you could reverse that and say that a third were killed by being dragged down by the tail and killed, and that 2/3 became the foundation. But I think it's more reasonable to think that the 1/3 part that were dragged down from heaven were ones that were corrupted. And that, again, my present view of this, there was a false minister or ministry that corrupted the thinking of a third part of the ministry of the church prior to the woman fleeing in the wilderness. The 2/3 part were primarily martyred off or died, and that third part that was corrupted became the false church. And then a little remnant of those who held true are the little remnant we see in the end of this chapter. And now we are the heirs of the legacy of that little remnant today, trying to hold on to those same truths, and that we hold true to the biblical faith and don't fall into the apostasies of that false church.